Good afternoon and welcome back. We're here this afternoon to hear from Tina about CSS crime scene. So I've been told that whistling and cheering is allowed, so go for it. There you go, Tim.
Some years ago, I worked on a project like this. The whole code base was like this, with these really specific selectors, and the only way to get any style through was to write even more specific selectors. You never knew what your style changes would break, so everyone tried to be even more specific to make sure. And a few weeks later, the next style change would need to try and overwrite that. It was fun. If you've ever been in a situation like this, welcome! My name is Tina, I work at Previous Next. I've been doing CSS since IE5 and 5.5. That's the thing you need to say to prove you've got experience, right? My earliest ideas of maintainable CSS came from a book called Bulletproof Web Design by Dan Sederholm. I read that sometime in the early 2000s, and his principles translated really well once responsive design became a thing. So they still inspire how I approach CSS today, as in how much can you throw at it before it breaks? How many screen sizes, how many ratios, how much content, how many variations, how many combinations of modules, and how much creativity from the editors. So over the years, I've written design systems for fairly big websites. I've seen a lot of code age. I saw what works and what doesn't. And while we've got some great tools these days to manage large design systems, the fundamental issue with CSS still exists, and there's still a lot that can go wrong. So in this talk, I'm going to share some of what I've learned. We're going to focus on plain CSS. There's going to be a fair bit of code. No CSS in JS, no Tailwind, no Sass or less, because getting the basics right is going to help you no matter what tools and preprocessors you use. So what's the problem with CSS? CSS is inherently not good at what we need it to do these days. It was originally created to style static content and not to handle complex dynamic components that need to work across a lot of devices and contexts. And even with all the recent improvements we had, like cascade layers, it's still just a global scope. So just from looking at some CSS, you can't tell where it's used or if it depends on any other CSS, and that makes it really hard to prevent any unwanted side effects. It's as easy to write as it is to mess up. So as we needed CSS to handle bigger and more complex things, we found workarounds. There are mostly lots of very strict and sometimes very subtle rules. And to be honest, we just constantly jump through hoops to not screw ourselves over. Before we get into that nitty-gritty though, I want to share some tools and techniques that are going to help you with wrangling your CSS so you got some good framework in place. The main thing that's going to help you to keep your styles for big projects organized is modular or atomic design. The idea is to build complex styles by combining well-defined reusable Lego blocks. You're probably familiar with that concept no matter what you're coding, and it's no different in CSS. You build small bits that do one thing well and then build more complex things by combining those bits. In CSS, that may not always be possible, but it should still be a guiding principle. We also have a lot of established conventions around to structure your CSS in a way to work around its flaws and to write more encapsulated modular styles and that are going to feel familiar to other developers. I'm going to mention them briefly. We've got SMAX, which organizes files into base, layout, module, state, and theme. We've got inverted triangle CSS, which sorts styles from the most general and widely used ones to more local and specific styles. We've got object-oriented CSS, which separates structure from skin, as well as the container from the content. One of the big ones we have BAM, which is a really strict naming convention that limits what you're allowed to do to help you not shoot yourself in the foot, but it easily dissolves if it's not followed to the letter. And a thing we got recently is cascade layers, which is a really cool new CSS feature. It allows you more control over which styles will get applied in the end. So for example, you can put all your third-party code onto one layer and your own code on another layer that's always going to top that. definitely use that if you're starting a new project, but it's not going to save us if you've got an old project, because it's really hard to fit in afterwards, because unlayered style is always going to win. All of these are pretty compatible with each other. They all cover important points, and we use at least the learnings from all of these. And now that you know how to structure your Lego blocks, put them in a style guide. Ideally, that's going to be a living style guide, which means that your components can be used directly out of the style guide by the websites and consumers. So it's not just a how-to guide that tells the backend developers what to do in their system, which needs to be maintained separately, because we know that never happens. So living style guide is really the only reliable way to keep it relevant. Storybook's a good tool for this, but we also have CSS or Fractal, and I'm sure there's others, so whatever works for your project. Once you've got your modules in a living style guide and compose them nicely from atoms to bigger modules, you can take it one step further and soft decouple them from Drupal, or semi-decouple. That means writing an interface that the component will work with, and Drupal only needs to worry about loading the right template with the right variables. That one's leading us away from CSS a bit, and I'm mentioning it only to give you a background how we manage to keep styles very, very modular, because in Drupal that can get a bit hard at times. If you're interested to hear more about how to do that, my colleague Adam is having a talk tomorrow about object-oriented theming with Pinto, so have a look at that. The next advantage of a style guide is being able to run automated tests on your modules and variations. And once you've set up accessibility tests, visual regression testing, and unit tests, all your changes that you make have a much better chance of being picked up in one of these tests, and it's going to make you much more comfortable changing code in the first place. While you're here, add some linting to keep your code consistent and discourage things you don't want to see, and you'll have a great base for your code in place. And last but not least, comment your code. This may seem obvious, but some good things to comment are, say, some awkward CSS that you have to write because you need to override code from a third-party library, or you need to override some organically grown mess that you can't fix without taking everything down first, or maybe a temporary fix until browsers support a certain standard way of doing things. Those are always really hard to track down after the fact. So CSS is really easy to write, but it's not as self-explanatory as it looks. So it's really nice if you leave some breadcrumbs for the next developer who's trying to figure out if they can take that bit of code down now. Maybe do a follow-up ticket as well. So now that we've got these things in place, we've got a really good base for writing maintainable CSS, and we can finally look at those pitfalls that I mentioned before. So let's have a look how we can make CSS more bulletproof. The main problem we all keep running into is the so-called specificity wars. I can say that word now, I've practiced. So because everything in CSS is global, you're going to run into conflict sooner or later. And pretty much everything I talk about will be to reduce specificity one way or another. Here's a quick recap, how it's calculated. You've got your 4 weight categories. They don't, like the numbers just count up, they don't run into each other, and you've got your inline styles at the highest specificity and your elements on the lowest side. As a quick example, have a look at these selectors. The first one, I left out the inline styles, obviously. So the first one has 1 ID, 1 class, and 3 elements. The next one has the attribute selector, which is the same as a class, so 2 classes and 3 elements. And the last one has 3 classes and 3 elements. So your hover style in the last line would override the second rule, but not the first one. Like, I'm sure you've all run into this. That's what's starting to cause complexity if you need to overwrite this. At this point, I really want to look at some cool new tools we got recently in CSS, which is not, is, has, and where. I regularly run into this kind of code. So imagine you've got a menu, and your task is to change some styles everywhere except for the active class menu items. The markup you've got is pretty complex, there's lots of styles already, and you're unsure what you'd be interfering with, so thank goodness we've got not, right? And a week later, you need to add a special nav item class with different styles, maybe a call to action link or something like that. So you do this, and you find that it doesn't work. By the way, not didn't increase the specificity here like a normal pseudo class would. It's the targeted selector that does. And I've seen really complex stuff in those targeted selectors, so it gets fun very quickly. Ideally, you'll be able to rewrite your styles more like this, which has your default styles at the start, like the more wider reaching ones, and then the more specific you get, the later you write them and load them. That's your inverted triangle CSS. But often we've got a mess inherited and we can't change it that easily. Usually your code is more complex than this as well. So if you have to, you can add the where selector, because that one sets the specificity of its selectors to 0, so you're canceling out this whole not extra specificity. So neither of these pseudo classes, the not, is, has, and where, get a value in the specificity calculation as normal pseudo classes would. Not, is, and has take the value of the selector they're targeting, while where sets it to 0. That'll be really good to keep in mind to avoid accidentally increasing specificity with not. The next big thing I want to mention is you need to keep clear boundaries between your modules. Some of your modules are going to be containers, some are going to be content. Some need to function as both, depending on the context. But either way, they shouldn't interfere with each other. Containers shouldn't care about their content, and content shouldn't care where it sits. I often run into this kind of code. There's two things going wrong here. The first is the text align and the grid class. Assuming that grid is a class that's used in wide contexts with lots of different child elements, and using styles that are inherited by the child nodes will cause side effects. We actually had that happen in a project where general paragraphs used a text align, and all the components that could possibly appear in those paragraphs either relied on those styles or had to undo it. At some point, they needed to change the text align, but it turned into so much work and had so many knock-on effects that we didn't do it in the end. And that's a real problem if your CSS gets stuck like that. That's also leading me to the second problem that you see in here, which is styling the card on the basis of being in a grid. With that, you've automatically coupled your modules, and you're going to run into problems if either you need to add another card to the grid that shouldn't be styled like this, or if your grid is needed in a context that shouldn't affect cards that way. In those cases, you would have to override the code, which only gets more complex down the track. So the ideal solution here is to create a separate card variant, card mod in this case, and call that one instead. That keeps everything as separate as you need it to. By the way, Drupal likes to have extra wrappers around things, which sometimes can ruin, for example, grids. For those cases, you can add a class on the wrapper and either use display contents or use subgrid, which is really awesome. If you really can't add a variant, it's better to let your component react to its surroundings rather than styling a child from the parent. It's still not ideal. You still kind of coupled your modules, but at least all your variations are in one place. And whatever you do, put every variation you're building into your style guide so you don't end up with several undocumented same but different variations. Because it was quicker to sneak in a change instead of documenting it. And the next dev didn't know there was something similar already existing and ended up building his own implementation. Those things get really hard to track down later and figure out, can I remove them? Were they supposed to be different? Were they different at some point? So yeah, document everything. Should be easy with a living style guide, right? And together with that previous example of containers styling their children, I often see something that's called weak selector intent. If we have a look at this way of styling the main nav, that works for now, but it's not future-proof. Because you can't add any other lists to the header that shouldn't look like the main styles, you have to override them. And because you can't change the markup without messing up the styling. The reason for this is that our key selector, that's the one to the right, is too broad. We can fix that by making sure that the selector matches our reason for styling. In this case, do we really want to style every list in the header, or do we really just want to style the main nav? BAM really helps with selector intent, but only if you stick to it. Like something like this is not BAM, don't do it. Admittedly, it means that we probably need to name more things than we want and add variations for every difference, which can seem tedious, but it's really good to stay out of trouble. By the way, when naming things, try to name them by function, not by content. So for example, a cart event class feels much less reusable than cart teaser, whatever it may be. The last thing I want to talk about is how you can use CSS custom properties. Forgive me if I call them variables, they really are custom properties, and it's a better way to think about them, but variables is just shorter. How you can use them to encapsulate your modules. It's not proper encapsulation because we still have a global scope, but you get the idea. So if you have a look at this code, we've got all our colors defined globally, and then we can just start using them in our modules, right? But a few brand versions later, you had to introduce new variants, you had to add different hover and focus colors, and you probably had to add some dark background version, and your code is going to start to look more like this. So here we've got 3 more variants. We need to override all our properties for every single variant that needs them differently. We need to override the focus style, wherever the focus style needs to look different. And if I had added the hover styles as well, that normally change background and text colors, it would look a lot more ugly already. So now imagine you've got this code and somebody changes your side white changes to an off-white. But that one part doesn't pass the contrast accessibility testing in some cases, so you actually need 2 variables now. You need to figure out where the new off-white can be used and where it needs to stay the same, which needs you to go through the whole code base and figure it out. It's going to be fun. Some big design systems do that too, by the way. So if you end up using that and you need to change a color only in some context for whatever reason and not change it globally, you end up overriding a lot of the component. So how can we do that one better? The first step is to introduce 2 layers of variables. The first one is declarative, that declares all the colors we're allowed to use. And the second layer is the functional layer that assigns those colors to specific uses. That way you can change the colors you're using without changing the whole color system. You're probably already doing something like this, and this is definitely better. And if you're using pre-processed variables or the post-CSS CSS variables plugin, this is actually as good as it gets. But CSS, just CSS, lets us go a bit further than that. The first step is to take the functional layer out of global and remove it into our module. That way, we still have all our variations that we had earlier, but instead of overriding every single property for every one of those, we just change the variables. And the base button class takes care of the functionality of the button, so to speak. So we don't need to know the inner workings of the button anymore, we just need to know what variables we have and which we can change. If you have a look at the button border variable, we can also set defaults. So button border defaults to button background, just using the same color. And the button outline variant takes it apart and assigns it its own value. This way of doing stuff comes in handy if you need to add variables or variations later, because you can retrofit it without an issue. You can also write this whole variables block a bit differently. If you have a look at the button focus styles, I've set the outline color with the button color and then defaulted to a certain color. It's actually exactly the same way of having it in 2 lines above, of defining the variables and then defining the properties. So yeah, it's really just a a preference which way you want to write it. I personally quite like having this variables block at the top and seeing what I have and what I can work with. But other people prefer to write it in a shorter way. So use whatever works for you. So yeah, all of this is making it a lot, not completely foolproof, but a lot easier to override things for different contexts. And especially if you have a design system, the chances are that you'll have a lot of different contexts and will need to override stuff. So yeah, doing it like this will really help keep the specificity down overall in the long term. And with that, we've already covered a lot of ground, how to increase the half-life of your CSS. To quickly recap, make sure you've got a good framework in place, your living style guide, stick to your conventions, maybe soft decouple if you can. Keep your modules separate, like the one I probably see most often. Keep your styles from the most general to the most specific. Shoot to kill with your selectors. And use CSS custom properties to encapsulate your modules as far as you can. And let me know if you have any questions. Can't see anyone.